Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Winter Ag Workshop Series. I'm Cassidy, I'll be your host. Today we are joined by Dr. Berghage and Dr. Sanchez, and they will be discussing hydroponically growing cucumbers and tomatoes with us. So first, a little bit of housekeeping. Your video and audio is off for the entire session, but there is a chat box if you want to share anything, and there is also a Q&A box for you guys if you have questions to ask. Now everything is visible, so just make sure we're courteous and respectful. And in the chat box is a link to the pretest. If you have not taken that, please go ahead and do that. So with that, first we will welcome Dr. Rob Berghage.
Hello, everybody. My dogs are being a little ballistic in the background, so hopefully they'll stay quiet for a little while. One of the advantages or perhaps disadvantages of Zooming from home. So we're going to talk about hydroponic cucumber and tomato production, and I'm going to start out by talking about cucumbers, and then Dr. Sanchez is going to take over and talk about tomato production in a few minutes. Okay, so in terms of cucumber production, there are several different types of cucumbers that we grow hydroponically in the greenhouse. The two main types are European or Dutch cucumbers or English cucumbers. And then the other type is the Persian cucumber or the Bayat alpha. So the European ones are the long ones. They're about a foot long. You see them in the grocery store. They're individually shrink wrapped. Each cucumber fruit weighs about a pound. They're 12 to 14 inches long. They have a thin skin, of course, so there's no peeling required, which is a nice thing about all of our hydroponic tomatoes, so we don't have to peel them. You can if you want to, but you don't have to peel them in order to eat them. There are parthenocarpic or gynoecious cultivars, or parthenocarpic and gynoecious cultivars, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. They have an optimal temperature range of about 65 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the greenhouse for greenhouse production. So the other type of cucumbers that we grow are Bayat alpha cucumbers or Persian cucumbers, and these are the smaller ones that usually come in a tray, usually 5 or 6 smaller cucumbers wrapped with saran wrap around the outside edge of the individual tray. And those are also very thin-skinned and easy to grow in the greenhouse. And we'll talk more about how to do them hydroponically as we go through the webinar. So they're shorter, usually 5 to 8 inches long. Depends on the cultivar, how long they're going to be and exactly how heavy or big they're going to be at harvest. In hydroponic production, we're going to see much greater yields from these cucumbers than we do from the European ones. So 3 to 4 or 5 more times yield. They do have a thicker skin, so it's not as essential that you individually shrink wrap each one like you have to do with the European cucumbers. You can package them together. A lot of times they're packaged into a box, and there's a whole mess of them in the box, a 20-pound box you can buy down at like the Philadelphia market on wholesale. But as a retail, they're usually packaged in smaller packages. These can also be parthenocarpic or gynoecious, and the optimal temperature is a little bit wider for these, from about 50 to near 100 degrees. So with hydroponic cucumbers, and greenhouse grown cucumbers just in general, you want to make sure that you're using seed that's been selected for growing in that environment rather than seed that's been selected for an outside environment. It tends to be much more expensive though, as you can see from this slide. So our individual cucumbers are 100 seeds for $46, and it's a little bit more than that now. This is a slightly old image. So they're 50 cents or more a piece for the seed compared to, a few pennies a piece for field grown seed cucumbers. But you want to use these anyway because they've been selected for production in that greenhouse environment and for really heavy yields and large large yields, and they can tolerate that environment pretty effectively and pretty easily. So we were talking a minute ago about parthenocarpic and gynoecious. So parthenocarpic is fruit produced without pollination. So in most plants, to produce fruit, we have to have pollination and we have to have some seeds being produced. So parthenocarpic means I can produce seed or fruit without seeds. So our seedless watermelons and seedless cucumbers and those kind of things are parthenocarpic. If pollination does occur in these, the fruit tends to be producing seed, and the fruit will often be misshapen. It won't be that perfect looking cucumber that you're after when you're trying to do this stuff hydroponically. So gynoecious flowers are either perfect or they're male or female. So gynoecious are mostly pistillate or mostly female flowers. Okay, and so the advantage to having a parthenocarpic and gynoecious cucumber variety to use for your production in your hydroponic greenhouse is that if I'm using those, I don't have to pollinate them, and I'm going to get seedless fruit. And most of the flowers are female flowers, so I'm going to get mostly fruit, and I'm not going to get male flowers. And there's not really any pollen in the greenhouse because there's no pollen source in that greenhouse. So we typically are going to pick a parthenocarpic and gynoecious variety. So for your hydroponic cucumbers, you're going to start the seed in either Rockwool or Oasis cubes. So these are small manufactured cubes of Rockwool or Oasis. Rockwool is basically just a spun basalt rock. So they heat it up to a very high temperature, spin it, and then you compress it. And it forms like a long stringy fiber, and then you can press it into pretty much any shape you want. They're essentially inert and sterile, so you don't have to worry about disease or other kinds of issues like that. And they hold a lot of water, and hence when we're dealing with hydroponics and we're dealing with hydroponic nutrient solutions, that's good. So they hold a lot of water, but they drain well too. So you have good aeration as well as holding a lot of water. So we're going to start our seeds in a Rockwool or Oasis cube, or sometimes we'll start it in greenhouse potting soil as well, depending on where we're going to end up growing these things and what we're going to put them in for the finished production. So spacing of the plants once we transplant them varies depending on the type of cucumber that we're growing. So if we're growing the European cucumbers, we're going to need 4 to 7 square feet per plant. If we're growing the Persian cucumbers, the smaller ones, 3 to 5 feet per plant. Typically in the greenhouse, they're going to be put into double rows with the rows about 2 feet apart and 18 to 24 inches in the row and 3-foot walkways in between the rows. So the picture you're looking at right here is one of our systems on the campus greenhouses out behind the horticulture building. And this is called a Dutch bucket system, which is a pretty common way to grow cucumbers. So what you've got is you've got a large bucket, and this one is a homemade system. You can buy these online from hydroponic suppliers. There's lots of different places that you can buy them from, or you can make your own. So this one is a homemade one. We just went down to the creamery on campus and got leftover food grade plastic containers that came in with flavorings for the ice cream. Use those. They're filled up with some kind of an inert media, like a gravel of some sort. You can see in the photo, you can see the lava rock poking through the top of some of those. And then the cucumber itself is started in that small Rockwool cube. That goes into a larger Rockwool cube that's embedded into the media in the bucket. And then there's a couple of drippers that run into each one of those. So there's a constant trickle or stream of hydroponic nutrient solution that's running over the top of and through that Rockwool to supply that plant with its nutrient needs. Nice thing about a Dutch bucket system, or one of the nice things about using a Dutch bucket system, is that you've got a little reservoir down at the bottom of the bucket. So you can see where the outlet is. It's above the base. And so there's a little reservoir of water that's a nutrient solution that sits down at the bottom of that bucket. So if my pump fails for whatever reason, the electricity goes out or whatever else could possibly happen that would clog that up, I've got a little bit of time to fix it before the plants are going to start to wilt, because you can imagine, I mean, you've got a really large plant in the greenhouse on a hot day, it's going to use up a lot of water. And if there's no buffer in terms of that water solution, it can wilt pretty quickly and damage it pretty quickly. So in terms of the environment for producing cucumbers hydroponically, one of the main environmental factors is temperature. So it influences vegetative growth, flower initiation, fruit quality and growth, and the rate of fruit development. All of those things are influenced by the temperature. Optimal temperature for hothouse cucumbers and hydroponic hothouse cucumbers is going to be somewhere in the 75 to 85 degree Fahrenheit range. Typically, we don't want to go below 65, although with the Persian ones, we can go down to 50 for brief periods of time, but you really don't want to do that very much because it's going to stunt the growth of the plants and you're not going to get good productivity out of that plant. And you don't really want to go much above 85 to 90 either. That stresses the plant and it reduces the amount of carbohydrate that's available to form fruit. And so we're going to see more fruit abortion and lower yields when we get to too high a temperature. And we can see issues with pollination. I'm sure Elsa will talk more about that when she's talking about tomatoes, because you definitely see all sorts of issues with pollination in tomatoes once you start getting above 85 to 90. So the maximum growth rate is going to occur around 82 degrees. So we want to keep our greenhouse in that range day and night when we're doing vegetative growth. And then once we're starting to produce fruit, typically you want to cool that night temperature down a little bit so that you have more carbohydrate available. Not so much for the vegetative growth, but we're storing more carbohydrate into the fruit. So day temperature a little bit warmer, 68 to 72, and we're going to drop down to 66 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit for the night temperature. So larger variation in day to night temperature, if we have much warmer days and much cooler nights, end up with taller plants, larger internodes, smaller leaves, possibly more rapid growth. Cucumber is considered a fairly high light crop. So it has the daily light integral. So the daily light integral, the DLI down here, the daily light integral is the total amount of light that plant needs to grow and produce fruit. And the minimum daily light integral that we need for producing good fruit or good production in a cucumber is going to be something around 15 moles per day. And it's going to grow best somewhere between 20 and 30 or maybe even higher. To put that in perspective, right now in State College, we're short days, we're kind of cloudy. We're probably at a daily light integral of maybe 8 to 10 on a regular basis in January and February. We might get some days where we might hit 12. So if you're growing this time of year without some kind of supplemental light on those cucumbers, your yields are going to be dramatically reduced compared to if you have some kind of supplemental light in order to bring that daily light integral up to where you want it. During the summer months, obviously, that's not an issue. Okay, cucumbers, like tomatoes, require some kind of support. So we're going to have some kind of a trellising system in the greenhouse. You can see a picture here of what it looks like. So the trellising system is a support system to allow me to grow this indeterminate vine. So the cucumbers that we grow in hydroponics are typically indeterminate vines. That means they don't set a terminal flower bud. They continue to grow as a vine for pretty much as long as we'll let them grow. So we need some kind of support over the top, and then we have to have some kind of twine or some other trellising system hanging down from that support. So normally you're going to have wires above the crop. That wire that you stick above the crop to hold it up needs to be strong enough to hold it up. Think about 30 or 40 cucumber plants loaded with fruit hanging from that wire. There's a lot of weight hanging from that wire that we're supporting. So 9-gauge galvanized wire is stronger. You run the wire parallel to the crop, and it can be as tall as your greenhouse is. So for our greenhouses on campus, we're fairly short stature greenhouses, so it's about 7 feet. That works out pretty well for working with the students to, if you reach up, you can generally reach the trellis wires to move them around fairly easily without having to get on a ladder or a scissors lift or something like that. In many commercial greenhouses, though, if you have a taller greenhouse, you're going to have a taller trellis height than that. So it really depends on how much space you have available to provide for vertical space, how high your trellis wires are going to be. So in a larger commercial greenhouse with really high sidewalls, you might have a 14, 15, 16 foot height for your trellis wires. In that case, anybody who's working on that is going to be either on a scissors lift or some kind of a scaffold or ladder in order to be able to get up to the top of that to manage the trellis wire. So from the top of the trellis wire, and we'll go back to this slide for a minute. So at the top of your trellis wire, or hanging from your trellis wire, you're going to have some kind of a twine holder, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So it's a holder for your trellising supports. In this case, it's a roller ball. And so you can see the twine hanging down from that. It might also be a tomahawk. And in both systems, you can move these around along on that wire. So here you can see what the tomahawks looks like. That's another type. So you can see the twine wrapped around that and then hanging down from the plant. So as you grow the cucumber, you're going to clip it to that wire. You can buy these clips online. It needs to be clipped or tied at the base. And then from there up, you can either wrap it or you can clip it. What we found with working with students is that wrapping it doesn't work very well because the students are not real good at making sure that you're always putting it on in the same direction. You're always wrapping it in the same direction. What happens is if you reverse the wrapping, the way you're twisting it around that twine, at any point, the thing tends to slip down. So it works better for us anyway, when we're growing this stuff, to have a lot of clips around it. If you don't wrap in the same direction, this is what happens, right? So the thing slides down and you end up with this big mass of nasty looking plants that's kind of not supported properly at the base of your trellising system, which is not what you want. You don't want that to happen in your hydroponic cucumber production. So there's a couple of different trellising approaches, ways that we manage that. The most common approach historically has been what we call an umbrella system or a modified umbrella system. And the way that works is your cucumber plant is planted into whatever substrate system you're using. You have a primary main stem that grows up. And then when I reach the top of my trellis wire, I'm going to take the main stem, or maybe one of the laterals at the top, depending on which way I'm working it. But I'm going to take the main stem and promote it over to the side and then let it drop back down. And then I'm going to take a lateral and promote that across the other side and let it drop back down to maximize my productivity. This is what I would do with a Persian cucumber system. And then for the first 4 or 5 nodes, you're going to remove all of the fruit. All you're going to do is leave leaves. I want to produce a fairly heavy plant with a lot of leaf area in order to maximize my productivity. After that, you'll take 1 or 2 nodes and pinch off the lateral branches as they start to grow and leave maybe 1 fruit behind at that, and maybe the fruit on the at the lateral bud. And then after that, we're going to go to still pinching off the laterals, but we're going to leave 2 fruits behind. Okay. And so you can see where you get a lot of fruit off from an individual plant doing this. And the modification, there's all sorts of different ways that you can modify that. So that's the most common way in the past in particular. And this way is what we would recommend that you do if you have a low profile growing area. If you have a really high profile growing area, you can probably do a drop and lean system like we do with tomatoes. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Okay. Commercially, most growers don't remove the tendrils. So most growers leave the tendrils on. We remove them in our hydroponics class and aquaponics class simply because they tend to tangle things up and it tends to make kind of a mess. But you can see how this cucumber vine is being wrapped around, and you can see that tendril that could be removed. So there are some other ways that you can trellis a cucumber, a hydroponically grown cucumber. So a V-cordon or a V-trellis can be used, or you can grow them up on the Hortinova type netting, which is a standard support. We use it for cut flowers, and we use it for lots of other things in hydroponic production or greenhouse production as well. Sometimes people will use this out in the field as well to support cucumbers. So in this case, you would support that netting from your trellis wire up on the top, and then allow the cucumber to kind of vine itself up in between the netting to support it. Your other option is what we call a drop and lean system with a higher profile greenhouse. So if I've got more than 7 feet to work with, this is not a bad system to use. And what you're doing with this one is you're as the vine reaches the top of your trellis system, you are in fact moving the plants in one direction around the greenhouse. And so you can kind of see how this vine has been promoted here. I see there's a materials list available for the Dutch bucket system. You can find those online. Yeah, there's a bunch of different systems, and they're easy to make, right? There's no real reason that you have to spend all that money to purchase a Dutch bucket system. You can build your own. You just have to get some food grade buckets, or you can go down to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy their plastic buckets will work too. Okay, so you can see with this one how they've been dropped and leaned. And when you do the dropping and leaning, what you're going to do is you're going to move it. You're going to promote the cucumber down the row, and then I'm going to remove the lower leaves. I'm going to remove the lower leaves also in the umbrella and modified umbrella systems, as well as they start to senesce, because they're not going to get a lot of light as the plant really develops and you fill up that greenhouse with a lot of plant canopy. You need to be able to remove that lower leaf to just kind of keep things nice and neat. But you can see how much vine we have laying on the floor down there. What will happen as you get too much foliage and you get too much fruit on the plant is the plant will start to abort some of the flowers. So it'll start to abort some of the fruit. It'll only carry a certain amount of fruit available in terms of finishing. So we'll remove those lower leaves as they start to get kind of ratty. So the leaves at the bottom of the plant, as they get older, they're not really photosynthesizing very much for the plant. They're not really contributing much to the plant. There's not a lot of light getting to them. And by removing them, we also improve the air movement through the greenhouse. So one of the things that happens when you have a greenhouse absolutely chock-a-block full of massive hydroponics plants, and you can see how big these cucumber leaves are when you grow them hydroponically. They're huge. When it's full of those things, you don't get good airflow, and that can promote disease issues. So to harvest your cucumbers, we want a fruit that's well filled out with a little bit of ribbing left on it, right? So I don't want it to be, super fat, and I don't want it to be starting to turn color from that dark green. That suggests that I've let it go too long. The size is usually a pretty good indicator. So with the Persians, about 5 to 8 inches, somewhere in that range. With the European cucumbers between 11 and 14 inches. And during peak harvest, when you have these in a greenhouse growing them hydroponically, you're going to harvest 3 to 4 times a week in order to actually manage them without getting them overripe. If you only harvest them once a week, you're going to end up with overripe. You need a knife or a pruner in order to avoid damaging the vine when you take them off. And you want to handle them fairly carefully, because remember, these do have thin skins, and so they can be fairly easily damaged. In a 12-week production cycle, which is normal for these cucumbers in a hydroponic system, you can get between 20 to 25 pounds of cucumber off per plant. Like we mentioned a minute ago, the European types are typically shrink wrapped. The Persian types are most often bulk packed into wax boxes or packaged into those trays with a saran over the top with maybe 6 or 8 cucumbers in, depending on how much it would do. So another question: could cukes be grown in hydroponic towers? You can. The issue with the cucumbers is you want to have as much vertical space for that for that vine to grow up as you possibly can. So you're already taking advantage of the vertical space because of the trellising system. So normally I wouldn't put it into the hydroponic towers. I'd reserve those for other crops like spinach or something that I'm not going to let get quite so tall. But you could. I mean, anything that will support the plant will probably work okay. All right. So Elsa, would you like to take over?
I'm ready.
Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen. You can share yours.
All right, let me grab it. Okay, oddly. Okay, let me try one more time. Okay.
Okay, looks good. I can see it.
It's right in the right mode.
Yep, looks
All right.
good.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about tomatoes. And as Rob mentioned, when you're growing hydroponically, it's best to find cultivars that have been bred for hydroponic systems. And so if this is an example of Big Dina, this is a cultivar that Rob and I have grown before. And as he was mentioning, the seed is much more expensive. Here we get 250 seeds for about $161. And this, if we looked it up again, it'd probably be a little bit more. These are a little bit dated, but you can get for the field about 250 seeds of tomatoes for about $12. So there's a huge price difference and something to be aware of. Because of that, we don't overseed. So like if I was going to grow tomatoes in a greenhouse, I might, for outside, I might put 2 seeds per cell because they're pretty inexpensive. But these seeds are so much more expensive. We usually put 1 seed per cell, and then we might overplant by like 10% or so, depending on what the germination rate is. You also want to match the need to the buyer or the kids, whoever's growing them. They want to grow large tomatoes. They want to grow tomatoes on the vine or heirloom or grape tomatoes or cherry tomatoes. Those are considerations that you would take into account. For tomatoes, there's generally 2 ways that you can grow them. The first way is to grow 1 crop a year, and it's 1 crop a year. It's generally about 10 months long that you would grow that crop, planted in mid-September, and then keep it until mid to late June is one way to do that. If you wanted to avoid the coldest part of the winter for the greenhouse and your heating costs, you could do that too and start your tomatoes like in February if you wanted to too, and then keep them for 10 months. The other way you could do it is to grow 2 crops a year. So grow a spring and a fall crop. And we've done both with our classes. Sometimes we stagger them and have 1 crop starting in the spring and another one starting in the fall. Sometimes we keep them for a year. I can't say that there's really any rhyme or reason to the way we do it. We just kind of go for it. As Rob was mentioning with cucumbers, tomatoes are also a high light plant, and they have a daily light integral need of between 20 to 30 moles per meter squared per day. And as Rob mentioned, even more would be good for them too. In the daytime, you want the temperatures to be in the 70s and no lower than 60 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit at night as far as your temperatures go. For plant populations, we want a minimum about 4 square feet per plant, or about 10,000 plants per acre. There's also been some research that shows that you can get 5 square feet per plant. So you have a smaller plant population, but you're still getting about the same yield. The advantage then of using 5 square feet versus 4 square feet is you don't have as many plants as that you're growing and maintaining and seed that you're buying, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something to consider. They're generally grown in double rows, the same way Rob showed with the cucumbers, about 4 feet apart on centers. So those are the row centers, and then about 12 to 16 inches between plants in a row. Just like with cucumbers, we start with transplants. And as far as if you're using an aggregate media, which is the most common way that we grow them, although we've also done the Beto buckets too, you need about half a cubic foot per plant. They're trained just like Rob was showing with the cucumbers, and there's a couple of ways or main ways that it's done. And so one way is to train them to a single stem. So here is the trellis wire right here, and then this plant has been pruned so that it just has the one main stem. And so they'll probably put another clip there to attach it to that. The other thing that we also see commercially, both of them are very common. I wouldn't say one is more common than the other, but is at the base, you select for 2 branches. So the main stem and then one of the laterals. And then as you do your drop and lean, one stem is going to be going one way down the row and the other stem will be going the other way down the row. And again, we've seen both of those very commonly. You also need the trellis system, just like Rob was talking about. The 2 main options for holding the twine are the rollerballs and the tomahawks, and oftentimes what farmers are using is just whatever they have on hand. I did want to mention too, at least the tomahawks, you can buy them loaded with the twine, or you can buy them just the hook itself and then load the twine on it yourself. So there's options there. Clips are also a critical tool, although as Rob said, you can also wrap them. However, as he mentioned, we haven't had a lot of luck with that, working without them sliding down. In addition to what he mentioned about the students and sometimes getting mixed up on which way to wrap them, we have a lab once a week, and so we're only doing the training once a week. I think if it was a commercial system, we'd be more on top of that, and that might help that wrapping to work a little better too. For fertility, the pH, you want to be around 5.5 to 6.5. This is of your nutrient solution. And there are a couple main ways to approach your fertility for tomatoes, or for actually any crop that you're growing hydroponically. So the first one is to use a company program. And so, for example, Hydro Gardens, Crop King and Jock's Hydroponics, they have a fertilizer that they sell you, and then they have a program where you add their fertilizer to things like potassium nitrate, calcium nitrate, and it makes a program, and you just follow that program throughout the plant life cycle. The other way to do it is to use a recipe, and with the recipe, you're adding everything. You're adding all the NPK and all of the micronutrients and calcium and magnesium. You're adding it all. We have done both of these ways with our tomatoes and cucumbers for that matter. And with our cucumbers, we've had a lot of luck with a program, the Hydro Gardens program. However, with our tomatoes, we tried the same program and we just weren't happy. The plants just weren't growing all that well. We didn't think that the potassium to nitrogen ratio was right. So we used the modified Sonnenfeld solution for our tomatoes, and we've had a lot of luck with that. The trellising system is very similar to the cucumbers. You're going to have those support wires above the crop, and the height of that is going to depend on the profile of your greenhouse. What we're working in, Rob and I, is a 7-foot tall high is where we have our support wires, and you want those support wires to be strong enough to support the crop. Rob was talking about how heavy cucumbers are. Tomatoes get even heavier. You're keeping them for a longer period, and the plants just get much larger. So it needs to support about 15 pounds of fruit per linear foot. It can get to be about 3 tons for 600 plants. So it needs to be strong. There are times when greenhouses can't support all that weight with just the regular structure of the greenhouse. And so in that case, what commercial farmers will do is put up a trellis system or some sort of support system inside the greenhouse, like you're seeing in this picture, in order to support that weight. And here's another system. So here they're growing them in 5-gallon grow bags with just potting soil in there, and they have 1 plant per bag. This is another way to grow them. One of the things that Rob and I always tell our students is when we're working with these systems to consider yourself in the system. And I personally like these systems with potting soil because they tend to be a little bit more forgiving. You know, I can go home on the weekend and I don't have to worry about them. Even if my timers break, I know my plants are going to be there when I get back. Whereas some of the other systems, you worry about that a little bit more. Here is a commercial greenhouse, and you can see that the profile of this one is much higher. And so they're growing their tomatoes. It's like 20 foot tall, Rob, 18 to 20 foot tall, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's about an 18-foot sidewall. Okay. So there's probably about 18 feet of vertical space.
So again, it's the height of the greenhouse that really dictates how tall those vines go before you do your dropping and leaning. I can see something came in the chat. Considering the expense of seeds and 1 crop a year, what is the advantage of growing tomatoes in a hydroponic system? Is it the ability to grow more tomatoes due to the use of vertical space? So that's part of it. You're also growing year round, where in the fields, you know, you're limited to the growing season, and commercially, you know, there's that local label that is important to farmers. And Rob, you unmuted. I feel like you're going to say something.
I am going to say something. So you're only growing 1 crop per year, but you're harvesting continuously after about 8 weeks to 10 weeks. So for the first 8 to 10 weeks of the production cycle, you're growing the plants, and they haven't started producing fruit yet. But once they start producing fruit, you're going to be harvesting lots of fruit continuously for that entire period of time. So it's not like out in the field where you've got the tomato plants and you're growing determinate tomatoes and you've got basically a big flush of production and then you're done. With these things, that they will keep producing fruit until you decide that you're done with them, pretty much.
That's a really good point. I didn't mention that, but we are growing indeterminate types of tomatoes in the greenhouse versus the determinate that we grow out in the field. Or if you're using a high tunnel, it's a mix of determinate and indeterminate plants. And we do see them get a little less fruitful towards the end of that 10-month growing period, but they do produce fruit all the way to the end.
Yeah, and it's not surprising they start to lose productivity because those vines are probably 100 feet long after a year. I mean,
I think I have some pictures to show that too.
They're crazy long. It's just amazing.
Oops, I'm not moving. Okay. So just like with cucumbers, you start off by tying the twine or securing the twine to the plant with a clip, and then you have the option of wrapping or using clips. We use clips with the students because we've had a much better result with that. You can wrap, just make sure you wrap in the same direction. Pruning and suckering is one of the tasks that has to be done with tomatoes. And what we mean is to remove the lateral branches. This is done about once a week, and you do want to keep an eye on that. If you catch them when they're smaller, they're easier to remove. However, you do want to leave one or two at the top because sometimes the top breaks off and then you can use one of those laterals to become the top. So let me show you. We've got a tomato plant here. There's the leaf right there. And in the leaf axis, we've got a sucker. And this is a good stage to kind of catch it. At this stage, we like to use pruners anyway, but at this stage, you can even pitch it off with your finger and have success. And so we leave it like this. If they get much larger though, you really are limited to just using your pruners or a knife, because if you pull them off with your hands, oftentimes you'll pull off the epidermis and it kind of damages the plant. And dropping and leaning is how tomatoes are trained. And so what happens is when the plants reach the top of the trellis, so for us, it's about 7 feet. That other greenhouse you saw, it's going to be about 18 feet. What we do is remove those lower leaves. Like Rob mentioned, they're not really contributing much to the plant anyway. And usually they let you know they turn yellow, or they start to turn yellow, and you know it's time to remove them. And then you lean the plant while dropping. It's really critical when you're dropping and leaning to know which direction that you're going before you unhook the plant or before you release the trellis wire, because that will help to minimize damage that you do to the plant. A lot of times that decapitation can happen when you're not really sure where you're going and things happen. And then you repeat. Every time it gets to the top, you do the same thing. So removing those lower leaves, again, they are just not contributing as much to the plant photosynthetically. And the upper part of the plant, about the upper third, 23% of the total leaf area, and that's where most of the light is captured. And that's where most of the photosynthesis takes place. And we see this like, even like if you're growing like in towers or something like that, the plants on the top always do better in terms of yield, in terms of how quickly they fruit at the top versus the middle and then at the bottom. So you're working with a limited amount of light. So here are some tomatoes that we're getting ready to drop and lean. So you can see we've removed leaves at the bottom of the plants. And then we took this plant here. There's a double wire. So this plant right here was hooked on this side of the wire. We unhooked it and we brought it around to the other wire. And then all the plants just move down a space. And then so you've got this circle that's going around. I hope that was a good explanation. I'll show you a picture too. So here's what Rob was talking about. The plants can actually, when they've been there for quite a while, they start wrapping around the base. And I mean, it's crazy. Like this plant here, like where did it start? Maybe it started over here. Maybe it started way over here. You just don't know once it starts moving like that. It's pretty wild. Did something come in on the chat, Rod? Okay, it looks like we're okay. Cluster pruning is something that you might consider. Some folks do it to improve fruit size and uniformity. And so what you would do is leave 3, 4, or 5 fruit in the cluster, depending on what your market is, what your goals are. And you remove other fruits when small. First, you would start off, you let them set. And then if there's any fruit that appears misshapen, you remove those. If there's none and you still want to cluster prune, then you remove the smaller ones. This is what a cluster looks like where we've got one of the fruit that has been pruned off. We don't really practice the cluster pruning with our students other than telling them about it. The other thing to be aware of with tomatoes is those clusters can get heavy and they can droop over and they can kink, which can be a problem as far as moving things back and forth between the cluster and the main stem. So they've got these J hooks that you can purchase that help support the cluster. It attaches onto the twine, and this is one way. There's other things that you can buy too that just help to support that cluster and that weight. Pollination is critical. So when we bring both tomatoes and cucumbers inside, we kind of flip things all over the place. So for cucumbers, when I have them planted outside, I'm worried about pollination. I need pollination to occur to get fruit. In the greenhouse, I don't worry about it. We're growing those parthenocarpet and gynocarpus fruit. Tomatoes, I don't worry about them outside. They're self-pollinated. There's enough wind that pollination occurs. But in a greenhouse, the air is more still. You don't have that movement. And so now we worry about pollination. And so in the greenhouse, you need to think about that. And there's a couple of ways to approach it. You can use electric bees, which is shown here. And this is what we use with our classes. There's several types out there, and they work the same way. They feel a little bit different in your hands sometimes, but they do the same thing. And you want to do that at least every other day because the flowers are receptive for about 2 days. And the best time to do that is between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. This is when you have the optimal temperatures and humidity. If it's too humid or too dry, that affects how effective your pollination is. So that's the ideal time to do that. This is something that our students do. They tend to enjoy it. Rob and I tend to get a little lazy about it when they go like for spring break or something. So they'll leave for spring break. Rob and I won't pollinate. And then 5 weeks later, our fruit yield goes down because we didn't pollinate. So it really is critical to do that. I'm hoping this video works. This shows the pollination process with those electric bees. Yeah. So you just touch the cluster, touch the back of it, and when the pollen is ripe, you can actually see it dropping. It's a neat thing to see. And you just go by all of the clusters and you just tap them like that. Once the greenhouse gets too large, then you probably want to bring in bees. And so it takes about 5 to 6 hours to hand pollinate an acre of tomatoes. So that's kind of if you have the labor, maybe it's okay. If you don't, you want to start thinking about bringing in bees. You need about 1 hive per half acre of tomatoes. And these boxes last about 8 weeks. And so you want to stagger them, right? I'll bring in one today and one maybe in 4 weeks. And that way I always have one that's not going to go out, right? I always have bees that are going in there. You don't want too many bees in your greenhouse, so stick to this 1 hive per half acre because it can result in physiological disorders like you're seeing here. This is called zippering, and this is because the bees have overpollinated, and so the anthers get stuck to the ovary and you get that zippering on the fruit. Once a bee has pollinated the flower, you can tell because here we're seeing the stamens and the style, and they turn that dark color because the bee bit down on its mandibles to get to the pollen and nectar, and then that's what happens. So you can tell when it's happened. It's pretty cool. You're going to terminate the crop around 6 weeks before you finish harvesting. And the reason you do that is because at that point, those fruit, anything that produces at that point on is not going to be mature by the time you are done with the crop, right? It takes about 5 to 6 weeks for those fruit to mature. When you do that, and so you do that just by topping the plant off at the top. And then leave some of the leaves if you can, and that shades the fruit that are there and can help with avoid having like sun scald. When you harvest, you can harvest tomato on the vine, like you see here. Maybe you're harvesting individual fruit, like you see here. You have some options with tomatoes. This is from a commercial facility. Once they're harvested, they bring them through this machine. Well, they bring them here first, and there will be people here doing like a final sorting to make sure the quality is all what they want it to be. And then it goes through this machine here, and they get those individual stamps on each of the tomato, like you see in the grocery store. And then if you do have to store tomatoes, they don't really take the cold. About 50 degrees Fahrenheit is what you want for tomatoes for storage. And so you can see there's a bunch of tomatoes here. These tomatoes are going to grocery stores. And that completes what I wanted to say. Rob and I are available if you have any questions, or if you want to contact us at a later date, you can email us. I'm at ess11@psu.edu, and you're rdb4@psu.edu. Did I get it?
That's correct.
All right.
So does anybody have any questions? Oh, sure.
What happens to the bees? That's the end of their life cycle. So that's it for them.
So you want to type your email in it, Elsa?
Yeah.
In the chat?
Oh, I do want to say something else about the bees. So we don't want to pollinate the cucumbers, and we do want to pollinate the tomatoes. So if you are bringing in bees, you don't want your cucumbers and your tomatoes in the same house. You want them in different houses so that the cucumbers don't get pollinated.
So Stacy was asking if there's a variety of tomato that's easier to grow. So what we've found over the number of years that we've been teaching this class is we've switched to a variety called Rebelski. And
I'll type it in.
the reason that we use that particular variety is because it is very, very mildew resistant. So one of the issues that you see with tomatoes grown in the greenhouse is powdery mildew, especially this time of year. And if you grow a mildew resistant variety next to one that is not mildew resistant, the one that's not mildew resistant will be just this white thing. It looks like it snowed on it. The mildew resistant one is still green and is still going to continue to produce. So you can look on the seed when you're buying the seed, and it'll tell you what it has resistance to. So tomatoes, usually you want to, certainly if you're in the greenhouse, you want mildew resistance. You probably want some other resistances too. I don't know, Elsie, you want to talk about that?
So in the, I think for us, and you're going to get to know your greenhouse. For us, it's powdery mildew. That's the big issue. Other cultivars that I see commercial farmers use are like the Big Dina that you saw, the Grow Dina, Geronimo is another one. And then heirloom folks do as well. Those are the main types I generally see.
Yeah, so there's a question about countertop hydroponics for home or classroom where you don't have a lot of space. You can certainly do it, but tomatoes and cucumbers are a real challenge when you talk about trying to grow them in a small space, because they're huge plants, and they get really, really large. Even the ones that we grow outdoors, right? Your tomatoes that you grow in your backyard garden can get to be really, really big plants. It's tough to put them in, and it's tough to get enough light on them in a countertop setting. So if I were doing countertop hydroponics in a classroom, I would probably restrict myself to growing microgreens and growing salad type greens, or maybe herbs.
Some herbs.
Yeah, things like that will grow better under lower light conditions and just really don't have to have the same amount of space that a tomato or a cucumber does. You could probably try, if you really wanted to try and get some tomatoes in, you might do some of the little really mini varieties of tomatoes. And then you can get some small fruit off from it. But to get the really big hands of fruit like Elsa was showing pictures of, you really have to have that space. And the same thing with the cucumbers. The cucumbers need a lot of space.
Those small ones too, are you thinking like Tiny Tim or?
Yeah,
They're more ornamental, but I still think a really neat thing for people to see.
well, it is. It's great for a classroom setting. So question, what system do you recommend for just beginning hydroponics in an elementary school? A couple tower systems. Towers will work, right? Towers are okay as long as you have enough light. Lighting becomes an issue. Or if you're in a greenhouse with a tower system, that's fine. If you're trying to use artificial lighting, you probably want to have some vertical lighting next to the tower as well. So take some LED shop lights or something and hang them vertically around the plants so that you get light coming in from the sides as well as off from the top, and especially with larger plant material.
You could grow like lettuce, spinach. You could even do strawberries. Rob and I have done strawberries in towers, herbs.
Yeah, and so the most common commercial production systems for those types of things are either an NFT or a deep water float. In a small setting for a school, I probably would stay away from the NFT, and I would probably use some kind of a modified deep water float system. So in that system, what you're going to have is some kind of a container that will hold 8 inches of water or 8 inches of a nutrient solution, and then you're going to float some kind of a food grade styrofoam over the top of it that floats on top of the water, and you can buy them. They have little holes pre-made in them. Where did we get ours from? Beaver Plastics?
Beaver Plastics.
Yeah, Beaver Plastics. You can buy them. They come in different size sheets, and if the sheet is not quite the size you want, you can always cut it up into smaller pieces if you need to. And then if it's a stagnant system, so if you don't have water circulating through it, you're going to need to put like a fish tank aeration system in it. So you're going to have some kind of an aeration system to keep that nutrient solution aerated. And then you're going to want to change out the nutrient solution probably about once every, what do you think, Elsa, 2 weeks or so?
2 weeks or so, yeah.
Yeah, I would change it out about once every 2 weeks to be able to produce it.
I want to mention too, those Beaver plastic trays that Rob's talking about, you can get them on Amazon.
Yeah. So question was about flavor. Seems like the flavor's been bred out of them. So if you actually grow them to ripeness, they're okay. They're not as good as an outdoor tomato, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's breeding, some of it's the environment is so cushy in the greenhouse that you don't have any of the sort of acidy flavor components being developed in the plant because it's not being beat up by rain or insects or wind or anything else. But if the ones that you buy in the store, one of the reasons they taste like they harvest them green, right? And they never really get ripe. And then a lot of times they'll gas them to make them turn red, but they're not really a ripened tomato. If you ripen it on the vine, the ones that we grow with our students, they're not super flavorful in the winter, but they're okay.
Yeah.
And the cucumbers are wonderful. I mean, they're so much better than what you can get in the grocery store.
Oh, I'll put our cucumber cultivar there too, because I like ours. It's Socrates.
Yeah, that's a really good cultivar. I agree. Any other questions?
Don't see any other questions come. With that, I am going to put the post test in the chat box if everyone could take that, so you can show everything that you learned. Dr. Berghage and Dr. Sanchez gave us so much information here. Do either of you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, so what we just covered, we usually take at least 2 or 3 class periods to cover in class with the students. And that's after covering all the basics before we cover this. But I understand you had a little bit of basic hydroponics before we did this, right?
A lot of people have been
Yeah.
attending past hydroponics. Yeah.
Good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone else for attending.